Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
All right, everyone, we're back. Brian Sanders here with another episode of Peak Human, where I talk to the leading experts around the world about health, nutrition, exercise, and how to live a long and healthy life. I'm a bit behind this week due to the holiday and filming a couple more awesome interviews for the Food Lies documentary. Every time we think we're done, I get a new opportunity to talk to an amazing expert. Yesterday, we filmed with Professor Craig Stanford, a USC anthropologist and world-renowned authority on primates, who walked us through how savage our chimp ancestors were and still are. It's no vegan utopia out there with them quietly munching on leaves and twigs. They hunt monkeys and rip them apart and eat them with their bare hands. He also explained the changes our bodies, brains, and digestive systems went through as we began eating more and more nutrient-dense animal foods and became human. Then today, we hit my alma mater, UCLA, completing the crosstown rivalry Professor Square-Off and talked to Dr. Aaron Blaisdell. He's a powerful force in the ancestral health space and actually co-founded the Ancestral Health Society, which puts on the Ancestral Health Symposium each year. They bridge the gap between the science and researchers in academia with the rest of the world. They're basically undoing all the weak correlations and bad epidemiology that's been done in the last 6 years that gave red meat and saturated fat a bad name, using actual hard science. It's a little sad that we need this group of crazy rebels to show us simple facts of human evolution and animal foods being the foundation of how we became human and continue to be the foundation of health. So check them out and support the Food Lies film at foodlies.org. We're on Indiegogo, and you can help us finish the film by clicking through, one more time, foodlies.org and pre-ordering a copy. It's seriously the only way we can fight this battle, which is crazy that it's turning into an actual battle for our right to eat the healthiest foods on the planet. Speaking of eating animal foods, Nose to Tail is going strong, and it's hard to keep all the meat in stock. By the time you're hearing this, we should be back with some of our signature products, such as the primal ground beef with liver, heart, kidney, and spleen mixed in. We've got a ton of nose to tail cuts of beef, buffalo, lamb, pork, and chicken as well on nosetotail.org. Quick thank you to the supporters on Patreon. Help the tribe survive with a few dollars there and help us continue to stay afloat. Get the extended show notes and Slack invite link on patreon.com/peakhuman. So on to the guest this week, Chris Masterjohn, PhD. If you haven't heard of him, you should have, because he's a force of nature when it comes to nutritional research. He's got a PhD in nutritional sciences and knows more than just about anyone concerning how fat, carbs, protein, vitamins, and minerals work in our body. He's publishing papers, putting out tons of great content on his site and YouTube, has a masterclass series, and is a great guy for putting up with all my questions. I hope he wasn't put off by this interview that I pushed to the very last minute before his next meeting. I wanted to bring up a lot of points that went against the standard nutritional narrative. I think a strict carnivore diet, or Victus, I should say, which is a better word than diet that I think we should all be using, is super interesting, and wanted to see what he thought about it. It gets technical in the beginning, but hold on and wait for the end, because that's when it gets really good. Trust me. So, here's the interview. I hope you enjoy it. All right, Chris Masterjohn, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, cool. Yeah, so I've been following your work for a while. You're the man. You have a PhD. You do lots of stuff. You can tell us about that, but you're really into nutrient density, into vitamins, minerals, so many things about how our body and nutrition works. So I have so many questions for you. So can you tell us your definition of nutrient density, and then I guess tell us more about what you do?
Yeah, I see nutrient density as eating primarily high quality foods that pack as much nutrition into your diet as you can. You know, I think that the USDA started using the term nutrient density recently, and they kind of have their way of defining it as putting in the things that we say are healthy, sort of like divided by the things we say are unhealthy. So they have their own little way of looking at it. I think, you know, really the thing that's important is, I think as a baseline, we want to select nutrient-dense foods as the basis of our diet. Mm-hmm. And so that means, you know, when you're putting together your staples, look for things that are really high in health value. But ultimately, you could easily design a bad diet that's very nutrient-dense if it's just really high in half the nutrients and lacking in the others. So balance is just as important as nutrient density.
That's important. Yeah, I talked to Marty Kendall about this kind of stuff. And he's really into like the harder to find nutrients is really important. It's like that's what we should be focusing on. And then what about per calorie or per, people have different definitions. And I know it's based on different goals, but what goes on there?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I have a nuanced view of this because looking at nutrient density per calorie is useful in the context of like you only have so many calories that you can spend before you start getting fat, which itself has negative health consequences. But you could easily be led astray by looking at nutrient density per calorie. For example, like the protein per calorie of broccoli is very high, but you will never, ever, ever get a meaningful amount of protein from broccoli because you're never going to eat that many calories from broccoli. Like even if you eat a very high volume of broccoli, you're not extracting much calories from it. The reason that the protein per calorie is so high is because the calories are so low, because it's mostly fiber and water, right? Yeah. So I think that nutrient density per calorie is often useful, but I don't use it that much. Like right now I'm I'm sort of almost done finishing an ongoing class on vitamins and minerals. It's a free class called Vitamins and Minerals 101. And I've taken to a system, each lesson is on a nutrient. And then in that lesson, there's a section on how to get the nutrient from food. And I'm going to go back and standardize across all the lessons. But after I did 5 or 6 lessons, I sort of landed on what I think is a really good system of ranking all of the foods into 5 tiers. The first tier is being able to hit your daily target in 1 serving. And I usually define a serving as 100 grams just because it's a standardized way to do it. Yeah. The limitation of that is like a serving of butter. Like it's not realistic to make butter a serving of 100 grams because no one's going to sit there and eat 100 grams of butter, right? So you have to take that into account. Or spices. Actually, spices, I did an exception. So like most spices are very nutrient dense. The thing is like who eats 100 grams of turmeric? Exactly. No one, right? Yeah. So what I did was I looked up like what are the highest spice intakes in the world in Indian diets, and I found studies on like the total number of grams per day consumed in the highest quintile in Indians. So I sort of like adjusted everything to make my own tiering, or like a unique tiering system for the spices according to, what would be a very spice heavy diet. But in general, it's like tier 1 is how would you hit your daily target in 1 serving of food? Tier 2 would be how would you hit your daily target in 2 or 3 servings of food. Tier 3 would be how would you hit your target in 3 to 5 servings of food. And then everything after this is kind of like you're no longer looking at a good source of that nutrient because if you got to eat more than 5 servings of it, like that's just too much to manage, right? Yeah. But if you eat 5 pounds of food in a day, and none of them are good sources of nutrients individually, but they're all pretty good sources. They're all like mediocre sources of all the nutrients. You're going to hit your targets for all the nutrients, right? So tier 4 is if you could eat, I think I defined it as 1 or 2 pounds of food. Oh, the rationale here is the average American eats 3 to 5 pounds of food a day. So 1 or 2 pounds of food will give you your target for that nutrient. And then the tier 5 is 3 to 5 pounds of food would give you your target for that nutrient. And so basically, if something falls outside of the 5 tiers, even if you eat a lot of food, you will not meet your target if your food is composed of that thing. So therefore that thing is actually exerting negative value on your diet, right? And so I think that's a good way of looking at it because it kind of allows you to say like, okay, if I really want to make sure I get all my niacin, I'm going to eat one of these niacin superfoods a day. And that's real simple. On the other hand, you could be like, well, I'm on the paleo diet and I'm not eating dairy, which is like one of the, superfoods of calcium. So I'm just going to make sure that my 5 pounds of food a day is mostly foods in this list. And then I'm still hitting my calcium targets. So I think that's or similarly, like on a vegan diet, you're not eating any of the top tier riboflavin foods, but you can get enough riboflavin on a vegan diet. It's I think that's the best way to think about the nutrient density, is to think about either I'm choosing to eat these superfoods that will really easily hit my targets, or I'm choosing to be strict about my diet by avoiding things that subtract from my nutrient density, and I'm just filling up the volume with all these mediocrely good foods.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So there's so many different ways to do nutrient density, and everyone has their own one, and I have my own one too. I think it's just the amount of bioavailable, essential fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins, minerals. That's one way to think about it. But you do this by the nutrient, right? Do you get a whole total look at the diet plan, or is you're just saying?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that at the end. I'm like 4 lessons from the end.
That's
and
cool.
And I'm gonna put it together in a book, and I'm eventually gonna put together a system for overall nutrient density. And I don't really like any of the ones in existence, or at
Do
least
you like Marty Kendall? Have you seen his
Yeah,
nutrient optimizer?
I have. I think he's going in the right direction. I agree with where he's moving the thing. I guess an example of one that I would be really strongly in disagreement with would be Joel Fuhrman's.
Oh, me too. That's what I was going to bring up. Yeah, he has spinach at the top.
Spinach is a good source of some nutrients. Some of them aren't that bioavailable, but spinach isn't a bad food. But yeah, what Fuhrman does is he sort of says, like, I like these nutrients and I hate these nutrients. So therefore these nutrients count and those ones don't. But also what Fuhrman is doing in general is sort of like, I alluded to this at the beginning, it doesn't make any sense to have a single metric of nutrient density, because like even on Fuhrman's scale, you could pick foods from Fuhrman's list that are high in nutrient density and still miss your targets for nutrients that Fuhrman wants you to get, because you put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. Like it wasn't balanced enough. So I think, it doesn't make any sense to characterize nutrient density outside the context of balance. So I think that I need to put more thought on exactly how I'm going to put mine together, but it's certainly going to be a lot closer to Marty's than to Joel Fuhrman's.
That's the hard part. I mean, I'm trying to do my own version kind of too, and also presenting in the film, trying to present people with this top level information, which is even harder because you do it in like 2 minutes. At least you're going to do it in a whole book. But I don't all completely agree with Marty Kendall's either. Well, maybe we should talk about bioavailability too. You mentioned that. So take spinach, for example. How much calcium can you actually get from spinach?
5% of it.
Exactly. So, and then also, I'm looking up all these different studies showing that how I forget what it was, iron or magnesium goes down if it's not refrigerated properly. All these things kind of
how does that? I don't understand how that could be possible.
I think it was magnesium, where they had a graph and they tested it, the days from harvest or the days without refrigeration, and they had 2 tests, and one was refrigerated and one not, and the magnesium levels just went down. I don't know.
But magnesium is an element.
That's what someone said when I posted that study.
Send me that study. I'll look at it later.
I will.
I don't. So like.
Well, I know some things go down.
So organic molecules can be degraded. So like folate, for example, is very unstable even in the freezer. But that's because there's like a law of physics of like the conservation of elements. Actually, that's not a law of physics. Anyway, so like elements, I was thinking of the conservation of energy. But anyway, with the exception of like, fission and fusion and stuff, like elements sort of like are net conserved. Yeah. So like in a food in the fridge, like folate is a molecule that is a complex structure of a bunch of elements. So that can get degraded, but the elements aren't going anywhere. So like magnesium, I don't understand how the magnesium could leave. Certainly the magnesium concentration of the food, it could be reorganized, and also like you're going to lose water and stuff like that over time, right? So the concentration of something in the food can change as a result of the volume or mass of the food changing, and things could evaporate. I don't think magnesium is very volatile. Like iodine is very volatile, right? So iodine can evaporate from certain things, especially from liquids.
What about in seaweed? If you had dried seaweed, does the iodine stay in?
Yeah, because it's dried and it's complexed with things. So iodine evaporates really easily from soil. It also evaporates really easily from milk. So like pasteurization causes loss of iodine because iodine's so volatile. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any data on like refrigerating solid foods and iodine loss, but my guess would be that it would evaporate in some foods and not others, and how much would depend on just like how complex it was. Yeah. But I don't think dried seaweed it would evaporate, because I'm pretty sure it's dried and complexed in stable ways. But I've never looked at data on it.
Yeah.
So I want to take. We kind of alluded to, or you brought up bioavailability. So I kind of want to broaden that a little bit. So what you really want is not like vaguely nutrient density or vaguely nutrient balance. What you want is you have a bunch of essential nutrient needs, and most of those things have some adverse consequences to getting too much of. Some of them have toxicity profiles. Some of them have no known consequences to getting too much. But most of them, if they don't have a toxicity profile, they at least have like something that can at least moderately detract from your health by getting too much. Well, and so what you want is for the absorbed, utilized amount of that nutrient to be well over the point where there's any probability of being deficient in it, without being anywhere near the point where there's any probability of having too much of it. And you want that for all of them. So that's what you want.
That's interesting. But one thing also, you could also get a lot of other stuff in the food itself along with it if you're getting high oxalate. But that's a different story. But this is really cool because I watched your video on vitamin D and the paradox, you called it. It's if you get too much. So yeah, talk about it more. Like there's a U-shaped curve to everything.
Well, vitamin D there's not a U-shaped curve to everything, but there tends. Maybe there is.
Almost.
Well, there probably is for everything.
Well, for water, for so many things, salts,
But there's no known U-shaped curve for riboflavin, because like the RDA is like 1.3 milligrams, and there's no known negative effects of taking 400. And there's at least one case where they've given a child 1,500 milligrams for a metabolic disorder, but like there at least is a U-shaped curve theoretically for riboflavin, because even if there were no toxicity ever, some amount of riboflavin would increase the concentrations in your blood so much so quickly that it would cause the osmolarity of your blood to induce a coma, like the way that hyperglycemia could. Okay, so there's a U-shaped curve to everything, but just like some things, realistically, there's not a U-shaped curve, because absolutely no one is using a dose that's been known to produce any toxic effect of it. But vitamin D, there's definitely a U-shaped curve, because vitamin D is one of the nutrients that has a toxicity profile to it, and so I don't know how much detail you want to go into it, but there's vitamin D deficiency, there's vitamin D toxicity, and you want to be in the middle.
Well, yeah. I also watched Ivor Cummins' D is for Debacle. I'm sure you saw, came out around the same time. Well, he was just saying how amazing vitamin D is and how related it is to so many diseases. And you talked about it too. So I guess I don't care that much about the upper limits of it, but maybe you could talk about the synergistic effects with vitamin A and K, I guess calcium too, and just tell us more about that. It's so interesting to me how important vitamin D is.
Okay, so at the most basic level, what vitamin D does primarily, this is both what's most understood about it, and is also, you could make a very strong argument that is, no matter what more we learn about it, that this is still should be the central thing we understand about it as a foundation for understanding vitamin D. Vitamin D is a precursor to a hormone. It's not a hormone any more than iodine is a hormone. Iodine can be used to make thyroid hormone. It doesn't make iodine a hormone. Vitamin D is not a hormone, but it is a precursor, is a raw material used to produce a hormone known as calcitriol that serves to increase the amount of calcium in your blood and prevent the calcium in your blood from going too low. Calcitriol does that by taking calcium from your food to increase calcium absorption from your food. It does that to prevent you from losing calcium in your urine, and it does that by taking calcium out of your bones. If you don't have enough vitamin D to make that calcitriol, your body will react to the deficiency of vitamin D and blood calcium by making parathyroid hormone, or PTH. The parathyroid glands sit on top of the thyroid gland. That's why they're called parathyroid. But parathyroid hormone has nothing at all to do physiologically with thyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone, PTH, will take calcium out of your bones and prevent you from peeing it out, but it doesn't increase calcium absorption from your food. And so vitamin D benefits your bones by suppressing the amount of parathyroid hormone you make, because if you get more vitamin D, you don't need the PTH. Because vitamin D takes calcium from your food in addition to calcium from your bones and preventing calcium loss in the urine, having more calcitriol and less parathyroid hormone means you put more emphasis on getting calcium from your food and less emphasis on getting it from your bone. That's overall net good for your bones. And the key way it's net good for your bones is by suppressing the amount of PTH that's circulating. You take less calcium out of your bones. If you don't get enough vitamin D, or if you don't get enough calcium in the diet, you'll make more PTH. More PTH means you take more calcium out of your bones. That leads to osteopenia and osteoporosis. If vitamin D is severely deficient, which is very rare now, it used to be common at one time, you can get rickets and you can get tetany. These are diseases of low blood calcium. In your bones, rickets also makes your bones low in calcium, but because the calcium never gets into your bones in the first place in rickets, because the deficiency is so severe, you actually get deformed bones as a result of that, and you have more severe bone problems. And tetany is a neurological and muscular deficiency of calcium, which leads to shaking and tremors and spasms in the least severe case. And in the most severe case, it leads to seizures, coma, and can even kill you. So vitamin D's control of calcium metabolism is the big thing that it does. But on top of that, vitamin D also regulates hundreds of genes. And among the genes that it regulates, there are some in the immune system. There are some, in fact, controlling many aspects of immunity, both aspects that promote immunity to infectious diseases and also aspects that prevent autoimmune diseases and lots of other things. But you alluded to the interactions with vitamins A and K. What it does there is vitamins A and D cooperate to make proteins that are activated by vitamin K that prevent calcium from going into the soft tissues, which are all the tissues besides bones and teeth, and put the calcium into hard tissues, which are the bones and teeth. So there should be some calcium everywhere, but there's 99% of the calcium in your body is in the extracellular matrix of bones and teeth. So the calcium that's elsewhere should be sparing. And if you have too much calcium elsewhere, you can get things like kidney stones, or if it gets into your blood vessels, heart disease. And you can even get calcifications in your heel. You can get them in your bladder. You can get them in your lungs. You can get them anywhere. But the kidneys, because the kidney is the thing that gets rid of excess calcium into your urine, the kidneys are most vulnerable to calcification, where you get kidney stones. Although calcification also plays a major role in heart disease as well. Now, I published a hypothesis that has some support, although because I kind of left research, I was going to spend sort of decades like ferreting out these things, and I left academia to do other things. So there's some support for my hypothesis, and that hypothesis is that vitamin D can cause soft tissue calcification when it's out of balance with vitamins A and K. And this is through overproducing vitamin K dependent proteins that cannot be activated vitamin K, and therefore are the pool of proteins that defend against soft tissue calcification becomes defective and can't defend against soft tissue calcification. There's some support for that. The conventional understanding, which is true, my hypothesis was meant to add to it, not to replace it. The conventional understanding, which is definitely true, is that above a certain threshold, vitamin D will cause hypercalciuria, which is too much calcium in your urine. And then beyond that, there's a threshold that will cause hypercalcemia, which is too much calcium in your blood. The way you protect yourself from hypercalcemia is to get hypercalciuria. So if you have too much calcium floating around, you don't want it in your blood. You put it into your urine so you can get rid of it. But that taxes the kidney with an extra burden of calcium, and that can contribute to kidney stones. If you get hypercalcemia, then you're really screwed in terms of you will get soft tissue calcification, broadly speaking, in multiple organs when that happens. And so that forms the conventional understanding of the sort of hard stop for the upper limit of vitamin D is at the point of causing hypercalcemia. But I think that it's underappreciated, conventionally speaking, how harmful vitamin D can be at moderately high levels that are advocated by many people, which I think can increase the risk of kidney stones, both through the mechanisms that I've focused on with interactions between vitamins A and K, but also by a more conventional understanding. You cause hypercalciuria before you cause hypercalcemia, therefore kidney stones are the sort of most sensitive thing that could happen. And in fact, a lot of the modern ideas about why everyone should push their vitamin D levels really high trace back to a paper that Reinhold Vieth published a couple decades ago that's been cited thousands of times about why we should look at Israeli lifeguards as our model of what our naked ape ancestors in the Paleolithic had for vitamin D levels. And he made the point that Israeli lifeguards who are exposed to a lot of sun have vitamin D levels in like the 50 nanogram per milliliter range. But the papers that he cited for that, the title of the paper is Increased Nephrolithiasis, which means kidney stones, in Israeli lifeguards. These people had 20 times the risk of kidney stones as the general population of Israel because they were getting too much sun. So I think that there are a lot of people advocating levels of vitamin D that are risky. Oh, and I've been the one who really popularized the idea that you need balance with vitamins A and K. I did a series of articles for the Weston A. Price Foundation in 2006 and 2007 on this. Most of what people are saying about interactions between A, D, and K trace ultimately back either to my articles in 2006 and 7 or to other people who were summarizing my articles. Largely, but mainly my original thought work on this. And I've always been relatively conservative about this point where a lot of people have taken my articles to say, yeah, push your levels to 70, 80, 90 nanograms per milliliter because you just need enough A and K. But in fact, no one knows that, and I'm not so sure about that. I think it makes a lot more sense to stick to what are probable ancestral levels not associated with kidney stones, which I think are, keeping vitamin D levels in the 30 or 40 nanogram per milliliter range and also balancing them with A and K. And I do think that there are some people who need levels that are higher than that, and I'm not against pushing them there in those cases. I just think that that should be something you do for a specific reason in a specific individual and not a blanket recommendation for people.
Wow. So much going on there. But so the problem is the main population is down in the 20s or lower. Do you know the numbers for them? So it seems like
I don't know what it is, and I don't know what it is, and it's certainly different now than it was 10 years ago because, and I don't know if this is kept up, but there was a long period, and we might still be in it, where doctors were routinely testing people's vitamin D status and giving them vitamin D if it was low. So I think that the vitamin D status of the population is certainly better than it was 10 years ago. But in any case, it sort of doesn't I mean, it's an important point, but we can't lose sight of the fact that, like, as soon as you start supplementing vitamin D, you're not a member of that population anymore.
Yeah. So are you talking about the more problems would be from taking it as a supplement or getting too much sun? How many people get as much sun as an Israeli lifeguard?
Not many. I think overall people don't get enough sun for the most part. But then again, there's people who get too much sun. There's both. But sort of the default of modern, actually, I would say there's a very large number of people in modern society who systematically get not enough sun and then blast themselves with too much sun at the beach.
Yeah,
that's probably a very
one of the most.
Yeah, it's sort of like getting no sleep during the week and then sleeping 15 hours on the weekend. Really one of those things.
Yeah. Okay. Did you see all that stuff about all these correlations and stuff with the diseases and vitamin D that Ivor Cummins presented? It was pretty interesting. How correlated.
No, I didn't see that, but I've read a lot of the literature, and there's lots of diseases that are correlated with vitamin D status.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even showing that the flu season could be related to the vitamin D. It follows not getting enough sun in the winter, and then it's not just that month specifically, because you can look at the other side of the world. And then the same thing happens different months, right? Like in Australia where there's a different winter.
Yeah, I think there is good evidence that vitamin D is anti-flu. There's at least one human trial showing a beneficial effect of vitamin D. And there are also a number of mechanistic studies showing the effect of vitamin D on antimicrobial peptides and stuff that have anti-flu action and action against other microbes as well. That's not the case for all of the diseases that vitamin D is correlated with. So actually I would say it's more common that we hypothesize vitamin D is going to prevent something and then don't show that to be the case in randomized trials. And I think part of the reason is that no one has ever shown for anything that the amount of vitamin D has a beneficial effect above and beyond the amount that causes maximal suppression of parathyroid hormone. So and I mentioned that before, right? PTH, parathyroid hormone, rises when your body perceives that you're deficient in vitamin D or calcium. And I mentioned before that it's not just the thing we know the most about, it's also the thing that we should remain seeing vitamin D as centrally involved in. And I think that's what I just said is one of the reasons to see it that way, that the current basis for the low end of the laboratory reference range is cross-sectional data inferring the point at which vitamin D maximally suppresses PTH. So basically they took like hundreds of people and they measured their PTH and they measured their 25-OHD, which is the marker of vitamin D status, and they plotted them they made a scatter plot of the data and drew a best fit line through it. And they looked at where does it appear that more vitamin D status does no longer suppress PTH any further. So like you see this line where there's a big drop in the line and then it plateaus or it hits a trough rather, and then it just stays flat and going forward. It's sort of like messy data because it's cross-sectional, right? So it's not taking people and saying like, I'm going to give you a vitamin D supplement. What's the dose and what's the blood level that corresponds to maximal suppression of PTH in you? It's just looking at like a bunch of different people at one time point. But in any case, that's the basis for the bottom of the reference range around 32 nanograms per milliliter right now. And my suspicion is a lot of these diseases, you might show an effect of supplementation if you got people who didn't have their PTH maximally suppressed. But right now, there's a lot of people who have either enough vitamin D in the general population or they're not that deficient. And so you're not seeing effects when you do randomized trials. And so part of the reason that I think the role in calcium metabolism should be seen as preeminent even now is because PTH is a response to having deficient calcium economy. And it remains the case that if you maximally suppress someone's PTH, you're probably not going to see a benefit in any other thing if you add more vitamin D to their system. in any case, you're right. I think that vitamin D has an anti-flu effect. I don't think that sort of like replaces the fact that like viral load trends are main determinants of the flu, but I do think that vitamin D status is protective.
Yeah, well, there's another interesting one. We got to move on from vitamin D, but there's a multiple sclerosis graph. Further you get away from the latitude and the further the vitamin D or 25-OHD status, as it raises, there's less incidence of multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, but that's one of the areas where no one's been able to show a benefit of vitamin D in multiple sclerosis, if I have the data right.
I'm not like super knowledgeable on this stuff. I think if anyone's listening, just check out Chris's video on this on YouTube, and then also Ivor Cummins says it's called D is for debacle, and check it out if you haven't seen his presentation. He spent like a year making it. It's pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't take away from anything that you're doing, or actually it probably should mention the fact that you could get too much more, and that talking more about A and K. So where do you need balance, right? Part of the stuff you brought up, it's so interesting to see all the effects of not having nutrients in balance, which is something that normal people don't think about. I think it's also interesting is that these problems can arise later. So you don't know that you're not in balance. You don't know what's going on. And then it could be years before you get these kidney stones. So for one thing, how do we get vitamin A and K?
The easiest way to get vitamin A is to eat like 4 to 8 ounces of liver per week, or a half ounce to an ounce of liver per day. You can also get vitamin A from cod liver oil. And then you can also get vitamin A from red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables. Well, actually, I should mention egg yolks and dairy products. The fat of full fat dairy products are a decent animal sources of vitamin A, although you're not going to get enough with egg yolks and dairy alone, but they will definitely make a meaningful contribution. Red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables have a form of vitamin A called carotenoids that needs to be converted into the form of vitamin A found in animal foods, which is retinol. And so the thing is, these are good sources of vitamin A in many people, but a large number of people have genetics that favor poor conversion of carotenoids to retinol, which means that they're relatively bad at getting vitamin A from plant foods. There are also many health factors, hormonal factors, status of other nutrients, digestive issues, and so on that can interfere with that conversion. And so, in my opinion, it is a wise insurance policy to make sure that you're getting at least the RDA of vitamin A from animal foods. And that basically means what I had said before about liver, cod liver oil, egg yolks, and dairy. But I think it's also good to eat a lot of red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables. And so I would recommend, if you don't have intolerances to those foods, to eat a lot of red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables, in which case those will be making some unknown, possibly very meaningful contribution to your vitamin A status. Then for K, there's 2 forms of K. Actually, that's a simplification, but one way to look at them is to break them up into vitamin K1, which is found in plant foods, and vitamin K2, which is found in animal foods and fermented foods, regardless of whether they're animal or plant origin. So, for example, sauerkraut is going to have some vitamin K, or much better example, natto, which is a fermented soy food found in eastern Japan, is extremely high in natto. It's the highest source of K2 measured, but it's a plant food. And then cheese is a fermented animal food that has K2 from the milk, but then additional K2 from the fermentation process, and that's an animal food. So fermented foods of any origin, and then animal foods are sources of K2. Non-fermented animal foods contain a specific form of K2 called MK4 that appears to have unique and essential role in us humans. Like carotenoids and retinol, which are the plant and animal forms of vitamin A, we can convert any form of vitamin K into MK4. Like carotenoids and retinol, it appears that many of us, maybe most of us, are very bad at doing that. So we do get MK4 when we eat any form of vitamin K, but it's probably a good insurance policy, as with carotenoids and retinol, to get some MK4 in your diet from animal foods, in my opinion. Fermented foods have actually a diversity of forms of K2 that are MK some MK4, some MK7, 9, 10, 11, etc. So and actually a good thing to put in the show notes would be Masterjohn PhD.com/K2. I have the ultimate vitamin K2 resource that has some good infographics about how to get K2 from foods and all about it. But basically the best foods that people are usually already eating are cheese and egg yolks for K2. The best foods that people are not eating usually are natto and goose liver.
Not the only problem is natto is gross to most people. I've tried it. I tried to eat it in Hawaii.
Well, a lot of people aren't going to eat goose liver either.
Maybe, yeah, probably. But at least a lot of these carnivore people would eat goose liver.
Some of them would, yeah.
Maybe. Okay, so yeah, this stuff.
I'll tell you what, I would eat goose liver, and I haven't gotten my hands on any yet, so it's not easy to find.
Yeah, it's a little expensive too. Okay, so the animal foods a lot more bioavailable. We can't convert the plant versions as well. So what happens?
Let me just say what I mean by that is I haven't been able to get my hands on fresh goose liver, like the liver pulled right out of a goose. I think foie gras is made from goose, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've had that.
Yeah. So what's the difference?
Well, someone prepared it, right? Like, so someone's getting goose liver.
Yeah.
But I found White Oak Farms sells fresh grass pasture raised organic goose liver, but they're sold out. They've been sold out for like a long time. Have you gotten it from them?
No. I just know them from their studies on putting carbon back into the soil. And just that they're doing really good, sustainable, farming and using the plants and animals. It's like a whole other side of things, is the environmental side. So they put out good infographics about carbon sequestration and stuff like that. So they're really great.
Yeah, cool.
Well, yeah, I want to try to get a hold of some goose liver too, for some fresh stuff. But So how does it work with vegans? So if they're eating enough of these precursors, and some of them are lucky enough to have their body convert them well enough, but then is this why people run into problems a couple of years down the road? Is that they're actually not good enough in converting these precursors, beta carotene and the K1 to the real forms?
Yeah, I'm sure if you had a current vegan on, they would probably dispute this. People have their problems down the road, but I was vegan and destroyed my health, so I'll back you up on that. Yeah, so there aren't any studies on like what happens to vegans' vitamin K status after they go vegan, and there's relatively little data on how long do people stay vegan. Although there is some data indicating that the dropout rate is very high. Yep. And of course, there's also data that the cheating rate is very high. So, like,
I can imagine.
There's a study like 10 or 20 years ago that something like 30% of vegetarians in the UK eat chicken or something like that. But anyway, like I said before, like, it is my opinion that it is wise to get MK4 in your diet, but there's no studies showing MK4 deficiency in people that are getting plenty of MK7 or plenty of vitamin K1. To make that argument, I have to kind of analyze a lot of different data from different places. And that argument is basically that, number one, all animals make MK4 and exclusively make MK4, so it appears that there's some essential role for MK4. Number two, we know that the different forms of vitamin K are distributed differently to different tissues, and MK4 seems to reach a lot of tissues that other forms of vitamin K1 or K2 don't get as well into. And then number three, mechanistically, we know that MK4 has specific effects on gene expression that other forms of vitamin K don't have. And so together, this makes an argument for needing to have MK4 in the body. And then the argument that we should get some in the diet is that if you look at different animals and even different strains of the same animals, so like different types of rats and different types of birds, can be very good or very bad at making MK4. Humans seem to be bad at making MK4, although there's not a lot of good data on it. And also a lot of humans, we know that there's genetic variation, just like there is for converting carotenes to retinol. And then also a lot of humans are on drugs that inhibit the conversion of K1 to MK4. So bone resorption inhibitors, which a lot of people are on for osteoporosis, and statins, which like everyone over the age of 40 is on practically for cholesterol, inhibit the synthesis of MK4. So, I mean, together, this indicates that a lot of us are pretty bad at it, and some of us are compromised further by the drugs we're taking. So a vegan, their only way of getting MK4 is to make it from other forms of vitamin K that they get from plant foods. And how good or bad they are at it, none of them are going to know that. So maybe some of them are going to have problems with that. And maybe that's the reason that some of them are going to stop being vegan. But we don't have data on that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say a current vegan. I have a new show called Sapien that's just coming out, and I finally got a vegan talk to me, and she actually came to my house. She was in town, and she's one of these vegans that's like just a year in or a year and a half in and thinks that everything's magic, shiny rainbows. But we'll see what happens to her.
Well, my health totally fell apart after a year and a half. So it's, different people are different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've talked to Lear Keith, who lasted 20 years, but had insane problems and permanent spine damage. I talked to Denise Minger, who had major problems, but all these people turned around. Everyone I've talked to as a vegan has changed their ways. So basically just eat your nutrient dense animal foods, eat Weston Price stuff. I found your old articles on Weston Price. That's great. I love them and most of what they do and what they found about these nutrient dense animal foods that like liver. And I eat a lot of liver and bone marrow and all these things you're talking about. So we're talking about vegans. What about the opposite? A lot of people eat a carnivorous diet these days. I don't know if it's like this big trend, like what's going on with it. I'm kind of in that crowd, but not really because I eat plant foods every day. So I'm certainly not a carnivore, but I believe in eating a large amount of animal foods. So what do you think? Well, let's just start off. What do you think about this whole thing that's going on?
Well, in carnivore, I think so first of all, carnivore shares a lot in common with veganism in that it completely cuts out whole classes of foods based on whether they come from animals or plants. Mm-hmm. It's in one specific respect, it's the opposite of veganism, which is that it cuts out plants instead of animals. Mm-hmm. So the risks are the same, which is that when you cut out giant food groups, you are going to cut out foods with certain nutrient profiles and become more vulnerable to nutrient deficiencies. And then, you mentioned before, like some foods have oxalates and you can just get too much of that. You're also vulnerable to getting too much of certain things on a carnivore diet. To give you an example, animal protein is very rich in sulfur amino acids. Sulfur amino acids are great because you need them to make glutathione, which is the master antioxidant of the cell, the key in detoxification. You need sulfate you derive sulfate from them, which you use for hormone metabolism, for detoxification, for structural components of joint fluid, for protecting your blood vessels from cardiovascular disease. So there's lots of great things about sulfur amino acids. However, their metabolism also generates some sulfuric acid, which is the major metabolic acid produced in the body, which isn't intrinsically harmful, but puts stress on the acid-base balance of the body and does increase the risk of bone resorption, which could contribute to osteopenia and osteoporosis long-term, and the risk of kidney stones long-term. And then on top of that, whenever you are metabolizing sulfur, you're going to generate sulfite, which is very toxic, and you need to convert it to sulfate. To do that requires molybdenum, a mineral that is overwhelmingly found highest in beans and liver. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you make sure you eat plenty of liver, you're protected from the sulfite, not so much the acid-base balance issue. But if you don't eat the liver, the lack of molybdenum in your diet from not eating legumes is eating a lot of animal protein is the thing that makes you benefit from eating more legumes from a micronutrient perspective. And so that's not a good mix there. You're also vulnerable to not having enough manganese and vitamin C, I would say would be the big things. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of other nutrients we could debate as well. But anyway, I think the reason people are going carnivore is because the principal claim seems to be that people are resolving autoimmune issues. Mm-hmm. I think that key hypotheses of why are that there are probably some people who just are very intolerant to a large number of things in plant foods that they're getting rid of.
Yeah.
But there are probably also some people that just can't tolerate oxalates or whatever, and they went on a carnivore diet, but they could have resolved that issue just by a much more narrow restriction of certain types of plant foods. They're probably lumped in there. And then there are probably people who just have some serious gut issues.
Yeah.
They're eating a diet that is not leaving fermentable substrates left over to encourage the growth of bad microbes in their gut. That's probably a contingent of carnivore folks. And I think they're getting benefits from those things. It's just that nothing rules out long-term detriment from nutrient imbalances. You know, your perceived health impact is always going to be driven by whatever was like the biggest lever you could pull. And so, you know, if your vitamin C or manganese status is mediocre and you're not at risk of serious deficiency, but you got some serious gut problem driven by fiber intake, getting rid of the fiber in your diet might be a really big lever for you in that moment. And so it's going to have a really big health impact, whereas 3 months of eating less vitamin C is not a big lever one way or the other. But 10 years of only eating 15 milligrams a day of vitamin C may eventually become the biggest lever.
Yeah, that's the interesting part to me. I think it's hugely important for so many people. Autoimmune, you mentioned gut problems, but there's even more. There's food addiction problems. There's a lot of people just find these benefits, and even simplicity. There's so many reasons people do well on carnivore, but then I think there could be these long-term consequences, because we were talking about earlier, there's a synergistic effect of these vitamins, and there's different balances that are needed, and also that they don't manifest. The problems don't manifest till later. So how can people, for one, eat nose to tail, which is huge, and you know, people, I love Paul Saladino because he always says nose to tail. Like, we're not talking about just eating ground beef and eggs. We're talking about eating a nose to tail carnivore diet with liver and with, you know, bone marrow and all these different things. So for one, with all those things, if you're doing a good nose to tail carnivore diet, you think you can get all your nutrients and have a long, healthy life?
I don't know about a long, healthy life because there's not really much longitudinal data on the health of carnivores. Like, I think there's a couple case reports of people doing carnivore for 10 years or something like that.
There's people doing it for 20. Yeah, here and there I hear about these.
Yeah, not documented, published case reports, though. So there's just no data on the lifelong effects of carnivore to speak to that. And there is no human population on the face of the earth that has ever eaten a carnivore diet. Traditionally,
it's the same as vegan. No one that we've studied. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Weston Price looked for vegans.
Yeah.
I have a blog post called "Weston Price looked for vegans, but only found cannibals." So he looked when Weston Price, who is a pioneer of nutritional anthropology, looking especially at people's teeth because his background was in dental research, but also just health in general. At the transition from traditional to modern foods, he was finding all these traditional diets were really emphasized animal products, and his theory was that they were sources of fat soluble vitamins, but they, you know, it wasn't just that they ate them, it was that they said, like, we need to eat these things because if we don't, our health suffers. And so he was like, I wonder if I can find somewhere people who only eat plants. So he was in the Pacific Islands, and one of the Pacific Islands he found, there were people up in the mountains in the inner parts of the island that didn't have access to the coast, and so they didn't have access to the seafoods, and they didn't keep any animals. So they only ate plant foods for the most part. But Price found this giant wall of seashells, and he asked them, the coast dwellers, what they were. And they said that they were frequently at war with the mountain dwellers, and at night, when the mountain dwellers were away, they would offer them shellfish as like an appeasement. They would trade the shellfish for plants from the mountains. And in his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, where I first read this, he doesn't really explain in detail any more than that. And it's like, okay, so we see that even when they're at war, they're trading plant foods for animal foods. Like, why? And so I found an old paper where he went into great detail about this. And the reason why is that the mountain dwellers perceived that they needed to eat animal foods about once every 3 months or their health would go haywire. And the way that they would get their animal products is that they would hunt the coast dwellers. Specifically, they would hunt the fishermen and eat their livers because they knew that the fishermen ate more livers of fish, and that the most nutrient-dense animal food they could get was to kill the fishermen who had eaten lots of fish livers and take their liver out and eat their liver.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden, the motivation of the coast dwellers to trade shellfish for them became clear. It was because they didn't want to get eaten. So they would they would fish for them and give them shellfish to appease them and prevent them from hunting them. And so I titled my blog post, Weston Price looked for vegans but only found cannibals.
That's probably the most interesting nutrition story I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. But
that's so interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So there's no carnivore populations either. Like even at the extremes of the Arctic, where plant foods were very limited, they did everything they could to get their hands on plant foods and store them for long-term consumption often. And in fact...
Or trade in the winter. Yeah, I heard about this too. Yeah, or trade for them in the winter if they couldn't get them.
Yeah. And in fact, I haven't read this book, but Honore Jones has a book called The Plants We Eat. Mm-hmm. And it's a whole book about the plant foods eaten by Inuit. And I haven't read the book, but the fact that someone wrote a whole book about the plant foods eaten by the Inuit is sufficient evidence that they weren't carnivore.
Well, I'm right there with you too. But I'm thinking theoretically, though. Theoretically?
Yeah, so theoretically, I believe that if you insist on being strictly carnivore, then the absolute best way to avoid nutrient deficiencies is to eat as nose to tail as you possibly can.
Yeah. But can't you get all the nutrients? You get C, you can get manganese from oysters,
Yeah, there aren't any nutrients that you can't get.
Yeah.
Whether you get optimal amounts of them is another story. And I think the acid-base stress question is kind of open there.
That's what I want to hear more about. Well, in a second, but still, we're talking about bioavailability. Animal foods have all these things in their most bioavailable forms. How could we not be getting the right amounts of them? Also, we've done all our studies.
Well, wait, that's a non sequitur. Even if that were true, and I partially agree with you, animal food, when there are bioavailability differences, usually nutrients are more bioavailable from animal foods, but that's still a non sequitur. Why does having high bioavailability mean that you get enough? That doesn't make any sense.
Oh, wow, yeah. So to just...
Like 100% of 10% is less than 20% of 100%.
Yeah. The fact that the animal foods have all these nutrients in it because that animal lived with their proper amount of nutrients. Like, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I would identify that. I think you're alluding to what I would consider a completely wrong myth about foods, which is that every food has in it what you need to metabolize that food. That's severely wrong. I mean, a great example of this would be like, you need riboflavin to burn fat. You know how much riboflavin there is in fat?
Well, I don't think that was my point.
There's none. No, it wasn't that wasn't your point.
Okay.
I'm using
another myth.
I'm using a reductio ad absurdum to demonstrate why the principle that, and actually that's not a reductio ad absurdum because that's not actually absurd. It's just a somewhat clearer case where that I was using as an example where foods do not intrinsically contain what you need to metabolize those foods. Like, it is absolutely not the case that by eating a natural high carb diet, you get more of the nutrients you need to burn carbs and less of the nutrients you need to burn fat, and that by eating more fat, you get more nutrients that you need to burn fat and less that you need to burn carbs. That's just totally false. And I use riboflavin just as one illustrative example of it, and I use an extreme case of fat, which has no riboflavin because fat has hardly any nutrients in it besides the fat-soluble vitamins. An animal has like nutrients in it because those tissues of that animal need those nutrients in it for that physiological function. But there's nothing that implies that if you just eat that animal has everything that you need to fulfill all your functions using the calories in that animal.
Interesting.
That, like, those aren't related at all, really. Also, the content of something is totally different than the flux of something. Like, an animal might have a certain amount of potassium in its tissues because that's the amount of potassium that it needed in its tissues in the instant it died. But that doesn't stop you from needing a 1,000-fold flux of potassium in and out of your body every day. Like that animal probably had. In fact, we can pretty much guarantee that. Like the content of potassium in the animal's muscle tissue is almost certainly extremely low compared to the amount of potassium. Actually, no, let me give you an even better example because potassium is pretty high intracellularly. The amount of sodium in that animal's muscle meat is almost certainly exceedingly low compared to the amount of sodium that had to flux in and out of the animal every day. Just because sodium's mostly extracellular, you lose a lot of sodium in your urine and your sweat all the time. Yeah. You always need more incoming, right? So like what is in an animal's tissue is a snapshot of what needed to be in that tissue at the moment that it died. It's got nothing to do with the amount that needs to flux in and out every day.
Oh, I totally agree. I don't know if people think that because it's like it's obvious that it's for sodium, for example, you can't get sodium. You had to add the sodium to the meat.
Know if people think what. I mean, I was responding to what you were saying that shouldn't animals have everything that we need when we eat those animals? That's what I was responding to.
Well, I meant using an array of animals that the manganese from an oyster, say. There is. I don't know. Actually, I don't know.
Yes. Okay. Let's go back to the original question rather than we've gone off on some tangents. The original question that you were asking me is, can someone eat the right mix of carnivore foods to get all the nutrients that they need to live a long and healthy life? So my answer is eating nose to tail and including shellfish, especially mussels, which are the best source of, shellfish are a good source of manganese, but mussels are the star source of manganese. So eating nose to tail, like in relative proportions, I guess, of the animal, as opposed to like saying you eat nose to tail because you ate some liver, and eating fish and shellfish, especially including mussels for the manganese, is probably going to prevent you from having any major nutrient deficiencies. As to whether it will lead to a long and healthy life, I think that's really hard to say. I think there are outstanding questions like, can you get enough vitamin C to optimize your protection against cancer and heart disease to provide for optimal antioxidant protection? I don't know. Are you going to have enough glutathione and thyroid hormone on a diet that's going to lead to chronically low insulin levels when insulin is a key regulator of those things and they're important for longevity? I don't know. How do you best deal with the acid-base issue? Probably eating nose to tail is a significant protection against that because the muscle meat's going to be really high in sulfur amino acids, as will liver, but the connective tissue will be very low in sulfur amino acids.
The glycine to methionine ratio.
Right. The glycine to methionine ratio is one of the things that's separate from the acid-base issue that comes up with sulfur amino acids.
How could you mitigate the acid-base? Like, could you be taking, baking soda with your water or something? Or is there little hacks?
Is baking soda carnivore?
I'm not carnivore. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to argue for carnivores. I think I'm just trying to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, but I genuinely do. I mean, I'm not that well versed in the carnivore community, so I don't know what they consider about supplements that aren't necessarily derived from an animal. But yeah, a little. So the best way to deal with the acid base issue would be if you wanted to be very carnivore about it, if you wanted to be ideologically carnivore about it, the best way to deal with the acid base issue would be, number one, eat nose to tail. Make sure that you don't want to get a lot of fat because it's going to decrease your nutrient density, but not eating really low fat, high protein would help. Also consuming proportional amounts of the connective tissues. An animal is half connective tissue. Yeah. So if you're making that level of use of bones and tendons and things like that, that's going to be protective. And then supplementing a couple grams of baking soda and some actually potassium bicarbonate would be the best thing. Supplementing a couple grams of potassium bicarbonate would be the best thing to mitigate the acid base balance issue, or maybe a mix of potassium bicarbonate and potassium citrate, because the bicarbonate and citrate are both useful there. And then if you're not going to be ideologically carnivore, taking like 10 grams of dextrose would help.
What is that going to do?
Because that's going to minimize muscle breakdown or protein catabolism. It's going to mitigate an increase in protein catabolism to make essential glucose.
That's interesting. I had another question about the optimizing the amount of protein and fat and carbs. Like, do we know if there's this optimum balance? Like, some people want to go 0 carbs, some people want to go keto, or, I have 30 grams of carb and then there's 100 grams of carb. Like, we know your body's going to make, gluconeogenesis, that kind of thing. But is there an optimum amount? I mean, so your body, maybe you can still be keto, but maybe your body doesn't have to work so hard to, I don't know. How does that work?
Yeah. Let me answer that question real quickly first. The reason I said, if you weren't ideological about it, the dextrose, it's my guess that most carnivores who are dealing with gut issues or autoimmune issues from things in plants could probably tolerate pure dextrose. That's why I said that, because it doesn't require any digestion, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, in terms of the ideal mix, no, I think people could argue about this for ages, but I don't think any population was like chronically keto either. So the best candidates for people who are chronically keto are the Inuit. And most Arctic populations have a very widespread genetic impairment in their ability to produce ketones. And so like they produce some ketones when they're pregnant, basically. But for the most part, they're on diets that you would think would be ketogenic and they're not making ketones. So everyone else, it's like if you look at traditional diets, actually, I think, so this is one interesting way to look at it. Anthropologically, if you look at the spread of traditional diets across the globe, the maximum animal product consumption, this correlates very strongly with latitude. So the maximum plant consumption is at the equator. Yep. The further you get from the equator, the more animal products you consume. So there's two things to note about that. First of all, at the equator, the average animal product consumption is 37% of the diet. I think that's by weight. It might be by calories. I forget. Anyway, let's just say a third of the diet is animal foods there. In the Arctic, like plant foods can get very scarce, but they still put effort into obtaining the plant foods. So it's sort of like one way to look at that is that humans have instinctively tried to push their plant consumption up to 2/3 of their diet. And, the key, like, why is animal foods not like 0% at the equator? Because no human population that wasn't forced to has ever in their collective wisdom wanted to eat a vegan diet. It's never happened before. And then why do you have this graded decrement in the amount of plant foods? Because plant food availability goes down and down as you get further from the equator. So it's like, I'm not saying that everyone should eat 37% of their diet as animal foods, but I'm just saying that the main thing that has driven people to eat more animal foods than that is lack of plant food availability. But no one has wanted to eat all plants when plant foods were maximally abundant. So
do you think it's really, though, it's just based on availability, that's why people are eating the higher meat?
Yeah,
and
that's
also,
yes.
Have you seen the study where there's a direct correlation between height and distance away from the equator and how much animal protein they get?
Yeah, I believe I've heard of that before. I know that I've seen research cited on height and animal food consumption ecologically. I don't remember the latitude correlation.
It's like a 50-page paper. It's amazing. There's so many graphs, and it's just all these correlations, and it's like a linear line based on how much animal, they call it complete or high quality protein. And then sorry, go ahead. Yeah, and then also you could see they do the line graphs that show that, but then you can also see the map where it's a distance away from equator equates to height.
Yeah, so I saw that cited in the China study because T. Colin Campbell argues that animal foods have growth factors that decrease the age at earliest onset of menstruation and increase overall height growth, and that those are the same growth factors that make animal foods cause cancer. Another interesting fact, and this isn't a direct response to what you said, but another interesting fact is that paleo people always cite how height shrank after the agricultural revolution and how our hunter-gatherer ancestors were much taller and then everyone got shorter after the agricultural revolution. if you look now, extant hunter-gatherers are shorter than everyone else. And they tend to be, like, most of the extant hunter-gatherers are fairly equatorial. They're also pushed into their, I mean, right now they're kind of marginalized in terms of their access to food and stuff like that. So anyway, I don't know. Like, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, animal foods are pro-growth and probably going to get taller when you eat more animal foods. Whether that's healthier or not, like, it's probably a sign of good health, at least in youth. But I wasn't in saying the gradation across the equator, across the latitude. I wasn't making a point about what's healthy. I was making a point about what humans seem to collectively, instinctually do. And regardless of height, I do think it's true. It's mostly about food availability, and a lot of it's calorie availability too. So, like, I'm sure in the era of the megafauna, you were like, why should I go like forage something if I can kill this giant thing and eat it?
Fatty
right?
meat everywhere.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not just like plant food availability. It's also like, do you have this giant slow animal that is waiting for you to kill it is going to be a factor too. And that's also a factor in, like, great anthropological quote that I think, like, everyone learns if they take an anthropology class is that the Kung San, who are equatorial foragers who eat a lot of mongongo nuts, they were asked once, you see agriculturalists around you, why don't you invent agriculture? And they were like, why should I invent agriculture when I have all these mongongo nuts? Like, those just happen to be real calorie dense and easily available. And so they neither go to hunt nor do they go to plant rice because they have these mongongo nuts hanging all over the place and they just eat those. And so, like, it's not as complex as just like plants decline away from the equator so you eat more animals. It is more complex than that. But the general trend, there is a general trend declining, not just declining plant food availability, but declining availability of calorie-rich, easily available plants is a key factor driving higher animal consumption. And at the Arctic, I think it's very significant that at the Arctic, plant foods are extremely scarce, and yet they still expend a lot of effort in getting them. Right? Like, the fact that it's sort of like the effort that is expended to get animal foods at the equator.
Well,
right?
To me, I feel like there's this minimum amount that we need. That there's and that's why I completely agree. Yeah, like, there's this 10%. It's like, I need these 10% of plant foods.
Let me give you another anecdote. I think this is really important for the carnivore vitamin C debate.
Okay.
So Weston Price studied natives of the Canadian Arctic, and he asked them if they knew about scurvy. And they said, yeah, scurvy's a white man's disease. And he was like, why don't you get scurvy? And they were like, hold on, we need to talk to the chief. And then they went to the chief and they came back and they said, so the chief told us that we could tell you because you are here to tell us not to eat the food in the white man's store. So we're allowed to tell you how we don't get scurvy. And they said the way that they don't get scurvy is that when the moose are around, they kill the moose and they take a little ball of fat above the moose's kidney. That's not a little ball of fat, it's the adrenal gland. And they slice it up into enough slices to feed every big Indian and every little Indian in the tribe a slice of the ball of fat, which is the adrenal gland. Adrenal glands are the highest source of vitamin C. And they said that's why they don't get scurvy. The white man gets scurvy because they won't listen to the Indians about how they prevent it. Why? These are people who were eating not carnivore, but very close to like as close to carnivore as it gets for lifelong, right? From birth. If, like, the amount of vitamin C that's in liver and muscle meat is high enough to protect you from deficiency lifelong, why on earth did they even know what scurvy was? And did they go through this relatively difficult and obscure way of preventing it?
Yeah.
Even the liver is easier to get and is much higher volume than the adrenal gland. It really sounds like they had nutrient pressure to seek higher levels of vitamin C than they were getting from eating. Yeah. I mean, you say eat nose to tail, but the people aren't eating adrenal glands. They're eating nose to tail. Yeah. They're eating liver and they're eating bone broth and So look, there's at the extremes, there was always pressure to seek plant foods / obscure parts of the animal that were relatively more dense in the nutrients that you would usually get from plants, like vitamin C. And in equatorial regions, when they had animal foods, they still ate a third of their diet as animal foods. And when they didn't have animal foods, they killed the fishermen on the coastline to eat their livers. So look, at every extreme, there's pressure to eat the opposite kingdom. Like, I think this is just like very strong evidence that the default for no human ever is vegan or carnivore.
I love it.
And then in terms of the mix of carbs and fat, like I really think that we have protein needs, and then you can make up the rest of it as carbs or fat as suits your lifestyle and choices and what makes you feel good, as long as you get your micronutrients in and as long as you don't overeat. And that's like, I think the evidence is converging around 0.5 gram to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And then the rest of it is like, you're probably going to be better off if you get at least 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate in your diet, but you're not going to die or have major nutrient deficiencies
your body will
if you
make
don't.
it. But so why do you think you need those 30 grams, just for the audience?
Oh, well, because you physiologically have an absolute requirement for 30 to 60 grams of glucose in your body every day.
So just don't make your body make it through gluconeogenesis. Just, it could be better to just get it through food sources. Yeah,
you're going to waste through your protein supply unnecessarily if you do that, and you're going to risk raising your cortisol, possibly adrenaline levels to put the pressure for gluconeogenesis. So I think it's just better to get
a little bit.
I think it's better to meet your physiological requirements. And by the way, your physiological requirements for glucose are only that low if you're keto, if you're very well keto adapted. If you're not very well keto adapted, your daily glucose requirements are closer to 200 grams a day.
Well, that's a good point. There's way differences between if you're fat adapted or not. And then I was going to bring up earlier is that all of our dietary recommendations and everything we know is studied under the context of a mixed diet. So it's hard to know some of these things. Like, we know there's like the ascorbate glucose antagonism, right? It's like they compete. So you do need less vitamin C if you're eating less glucose.
That's a theory
yes,
that,
I should have said
that has no validation, and I could easily make the opposite argument.
Really? So you don't think they need less? I mean, do you think you need more vitamin C if you eat more like carbs and sugar?
I'm not going to say either one, but you recycle vitamin C with glutathione, and glutathione is synthesized. Insulin is a direct positive regulator of glutathione synthesis, and specifically it's the insulin to glucagon ratio that regulates glutathione synthesis. You will have more glutathione if you eat more carbs because you'll have a higher insulin to glucagon ratio, period. And so vitamin C turnover is probably... Vitamin C recycling is probably higher on a carb-inclusive diet. And there are transporters that are shared between glucose and vitamin C, not really in the gut, but dehydroascorbate can get into cells through glucose transporters. Insulin would favor getting more vitamin C into muscle and fat because insulin increases glucose transporters in those tissues. But it would not affect transport into the brain or into many other tissues that rely on glucose transporters that are not regulated by insulin. But that's not really a function of carbohydrate intake. That's a function of glycemia. So if you have a slow and steady leak of glucose into your system that doesn't cause a major rise in blood glucose, you're not going to have any competition between glucose and vitamin C and dehydroascorbate entering your brain or your other tissues, because it's not about the amount that you ate, it's about the concentration in your blood. And also your blood glucose is regulated in a physiological range, right? So you can have a spike of blood glucose from 80 to 140 after a meal that is relatively short-lived, but it's going to go back down, number one. Number two, you can eat carbs and not have your blood sugar spike that much. Number three, it's a pretty small spike. Right? Like, you're probably going to have a lot of antagonism if your blood sugar goes up to 300. But, if your blood sugar goes from like 80 to 110, I don't think you're going to have a tremendous amount of antagonism of vitamin C transport, and it's going to go down after that. So look, like there's pros and cons of consuming carbs with respect to vitamin C status. Carbs are going to improve transport to muscle and fat and are possibly going to antagonize transport into other tissues, not in proportion to how many carbs you eat, but in proportion to how much your blood glucose rises. What's the threshold for that? I have no idea. And carbs are generally going to improve vitamin C recycling. Is your vitamin C requirement higher or lower on carbs? I don't know, because I can make equal and opposite hypotheses.
Well,
I don't have a dog in this fight, and I like thinking about possibilities, which is why I can easily make either case to you.
yeah.
If I had a dog in the fight because I was an ideological carnivore, I would have only made one of those cases to you.
That's good. Well,
If I had a dog in the fight because I was like an advocate of high carb diets or a vegan, I would have only made the other case to you.
yeah, I love that. That's why I'm talking to you. And I'm glad that I'm not on any side either. And I love exploring all different ways to eat and different ways people are healthy. So I know you have to go in a second. We talked about plant anti-nutrients. We didn't talk about like polyphenols, and you talked about glutathione. Okay, so we know glutathione is good, and we think plants are good because they give this hormetic stress. So I'm wondering, say in the context of a carnivore diet, people avoiding all these polyphenols and different things that are supposed to be good for us, what are they doing? Is that good or bad? And like, aren't there enough environmental stresses? You talked about like smoking can produce glutathione. It's like, is there enough things going on in our environment that can give us hormetic stress, or maybe even just like the charred meat can give us these heterocyclic amines or something will produce a hormetic effect? Like, do we need plants to do this?
So the reason smoking is interesting is because it's net toxic. Like, no one has identified
Definitely.
a dose of cigarette smoke that produces positive health outcomes. So the issue isn't whether something has the effects of upregulating our defenses to a greater extent than it causes toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
And so the interest in plant polyphenols is exactly that these are toxins that we've co-evolved with for, I wouldn't even say hundreds of millions of years. I mean, these systems are broadly conserved at least across mammals, and probably broader than that. So these, throughout animal evolution, we've been co-evolving with these polyphenolic constituents, and certainly in all of human evolution. And so we're well adapted to them, and we've learned how to exploit them to increase our defenses and to not allow them to cause toxicity. Then we have other things that come in, like, benzene or something like that. Maybe, or cigarettes, actually, go back to the one you brought up, cigarette smoke. It increases our defenses, but it doesn't increase our defenses enough to make up for its toxicity.
Yeah.
And we're not well adapted to cigarette smoke.
Of course.
That just makes it toxic.
Of course.
We don't care that it increases glutathione because it's toxic and causes cancer.
Use the charred meat then.
I have no idea off the top of my head whether data exists on the question of whether there is a net hormetic effect of charred meat. I don't know. You could take anything that's toxic and you could say maybe there's a hormetic dose of it. But look, with everything, so the hormesis is a great example of a U-shaped curve. Mm-hmm. In this case, it's not like a nutrient where you're trying to get enough to have a positive effect, but it's sort of like you're getting enough for an adaptive response. Anything that's hormetic is only hormetic in the hormetic range, and then it's toxic. And so I could imagine like another case for carnivore, and this is a totally hypothetical case for carnivore, but it would be someone has a genetic impairment in their ability to upregulate their defenses, or they have a genetic polymorphism in one of the umbrella regulators that responds to that stress to upregulate all those defenses. Well, then a smaller dose of plants for them is going to have a toxic effect compared to most other people. Mm-hmm. It's very clear that, like, there's case reports of people getting liver toxicity from green tea supplements. Right? So it's clear that there's people who have a vulnerability that, in combined with irresponsible use of the product, takes that hormetic stressor and gets a just flat out toxic response from it. So, in my possibility generator mind, I can imagine that someone has a genetic impairment or something else interfering with their ability to make glutathione in response to those plant stressors. And so those plant stressors are just straight up toxic, because for most of us, 5 to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables a day is a hormetic dose. But for some people, 3 servings of fruit and vegetables a day is a toxic dose. Mm-hmm. That's conceivable.
Yeah, this stuff is so interesting to think about. What about people eating all these plants is just displacing worse things for them? I have this little thought, or it's like it's this healthy user bias kind of thing. And like, again, I'm not a carnivore and I want to include plants in my diet, but what if it's just a proxy for people eating a good diet, or they're not eating something worse like processed carbs and sugar? And what if it is actually not necessary? We're kind of back researching it because we believe them to be healthy. I'm just saying, what if this is a thought experiment? It's like, what if they're not magical, that they're just kind of like a neutral thing that's giving us. Does that make sense?
When you say they, are you talking about plants or are you talking about hormetic chemicals in plants?
Either. Well, I guess plants in general, not just
okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, there's an element of truth to that for sure. Like if I replace vodka with kombucha, or if I replace Pop-Tarts with kale, I'm probably going to get some benefit of the kombucha or kale that is simply a function of removing the vodka or Pop-Tarts. Mm-hmm. I think alcohol could be a hormetic stressor, but forget that. Mm-hmm. If I'm drinking 6 shots of vodka a day and I replace that with a bottle of kombucha, I'm probably getting that benefit from that. But so the principle obviously is true that if you take something that's neutral or bad for you and you get rid of something that's bad or worse for you than the bad for you thing, of course you're going to benefit from that. But that doesn't negate the fact that it's not like we're just looking at observational studies of people who eat plants have better health outcomes. Like we also know dozens of things in plants and know mechanistically what they do.
Like, are you talking about the polyphenols specifically?
I know, I'm talking about dozens of different, like vitamin C in plants. There's pretty decent evidence that we would benefit from having 100 to 150 milligrams of vitamin C a day, which you can only get naturally from plants. Mm-hmm. It's not, there's one example. Why? We have lots of studies on vitamin C in terms of what it does physiologically in the body. We know lots of biochemistry of vitamin C. So if you wanted to be like extremely rigorous about it, you would be like, well, the way that you prove that this health outcome that appears to be true of plants is due to their vitamin C is you make that plant as it naturally comes, and then you compare it to just vitamin C, or you compare it to like an engineered plant that has no vitamin C in it or something. You randomize this and carry out a 10-year trial. Mm-hmm. We don't have that, right?
Yeah.
Nor do we have like anything of that nature supporting carnivore either. But what we do have is biochemically, we have 100 years of research about what vitamin C does in the body. We have a bunch of trials of different doses of vitamin C producing different plasma responses of vitamin C, producing different mechanistic outcomes on how to optimize immune function, how to optimize antioxidant protection, et cetera, et cetera. We have studies on like short-term markers, like how to improve blood vessel function and stuff like that. We have observational studies on correlations with heart disease and cancer with fruit and vegetable intake. We have observational studies, correlations between plasma levels of vitamin C and heart disease and certain types of cancer. We have mechanistic research into those diseases about the role of antioxidant protection or the role of collagen synthesis, et cetera, things that we know biochemically that vitamin C does. And then we have like dose responses that line up between the amount of vitamin C that it would take to a given plasma level, how a given plasma level correlates with a certain disease state, et cetera, et cetera. Like, so we have, and that's just one of those things. I could have said the same thing about any of the other nutrients found in the plant. I could have said the same thing about polyphenols in the plants. There's a lot of research that goes well beyond just an observation that people that eat X amount of fruits and vegetables a day have X risk of some X disease, Y disease, however you want to word that. And so it can't, with that amount and diversity of data supporting the argument, you can't just dismiss it with maybe they're just displacing Pop-Tarts or pizza.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that might have an effect, but it's also a fact that there is, all these constituents that are known to have all these effects that we would expect to have benefits on all those diseases.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Thanks for answering this. I had Paul Saladino on twice, so I wanted to have someone talk about the opposite side. So thank you for answering all these questions.
You're welcome.
And I recommend sort of basically a low carbs Weston price diet. It's like I like all the Weston price stuff, all the stuff, fermented vegetables, all this good stuff. I'd rather be fat adapted. So I'm kind of on the same page with you on a lot of this, and I know you got to go. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Well, I'll list where to find you in the show notes, and thank you. Bye.
Cool. Take care.
All right. That's a wrap. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. Thanks for pre-ordering the film Food Lies. Thank you for following me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you want. I try to put out stuff every day about all the things I'm learning and all this crazy stuff that's going on with vegans and censorship on Facebook and my post being blocked and all that stuff. Nosetotail.org is where you get the meat. Leave the podcast a review if you don't have any money and you can't buy any meat and you can't go on Patreon. You can't pre-order the film, or you already did. Just give us a review on iTunes or podcast app or wherever and help Peak Human get noticed just a little bit more, and we can spread the good word. Thank you. See you next week. Stay happy and healthy, my friends.